At 01:15 on the morning of June 6, 1944, Major Friedrich Vondran looked out of his headquarters window near the town of Carentan, and the sound he heard caused a deep, unsettling fear to rise within him. The air above the Carentan Peninsula was filled with the powerful, unceasing roar of countless aircraft engines. Hundreds, perhaps even thousands of planes. The noise seemed to emanate from every direction simultaneously, an intense mechanical sound that appeared to consume the entire night. Vondran was a hardened combat veteran. He had parachuted onto Crete in 1941, fought with the elite Romkey Brigade in North Africa, and experienced the brutal combat of the Eastern Front. Yet nothing in his long career had prepared him for the events that were about to unfold. Within the next 3 hours, over 13,000 American airborne soldiers would descend from that dark sky. They would land haphazardly in farm fields, swampy marshes, on building roofs, tangled in trees, and directly into the heart of German defensive positions. They would arrive scattered, disorganized, with many separated from their vital weapons and equipment. And in their chaotic state, they would terrorize the Wehrmacht in ways that went far beyond any tactical expectation. What Vondran did not comprehend, what no German strategist could have predicted, was that the very disorder of this parachute drop would become its most devastating weapon. The Americans were not establishing orderly positions, they were arriving absolutely everywhere. And that single simple word, everywhere, would become a persistent theme in German after-action reports, private journals, and prisoner interrogation files throughout the following weeks. The German officers who survived the brutal fighting in Normandy would later write about these paratroopers with a sentiment bordering on reverence. Some accounts expressed outright fear. A few displayed the type of grudging professional respect that only soldiers earn from an enemy who has proven their worth. This is the true story of how American paratroopers pioneered a new kind of psychological warfare. It was achieved not through sophisticated military planning, but through sheer grit, the ability to adapt, and an overwhelming offensive spirit that completely caught the powerful German military off guard. The German army in 1944 was, arguably, the most professional and formidable fighting force globally. Its officer corps had been trained in a tradition of military excellence dating back to the era of Frederick the Great. German military doctrine emphasized methodical planning, flawless operational synchronization, and the deliberate application of decisive, overwhelming power at key strategic locations. The Wehrmacht had crushed Poland in just 27 days. France had surrendered within 6 weeks. The German war machine had moved across the European continent with a chilling mechanical precision. However, a critical vulnerability was embedded within this very strength. German military philosophy relied on a deep understanding of the enemy. It required knowing precisely where the opposing force was positioned, what their strategic goals were, and exactly how they intended to achieve them. German officers were trained to analyze the theater of war as a chess grandmaster views a board, predicting enemy movements, calculating counter-responses, and always maintaining strict control over the situation. The American paratroopers who plunged into Normandy totally destroyed this strategic foundation. It wasn't because the Americans had better training or superior weaponry. It was because they did something the German High Command could not mentally process. They continued to fight effectively while immersed in absolute disorder. The German chain of command on the night of June 5th exemplified organizational rigidity. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander of Army Group B, was not even in France. He had traveled back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, convinced that the severe weather conditions made an Allied invasion impossible. General Wilhelm Falley, the commander of the 91st Air Landing Division, was en route to Rennes for a military war game simulation. His division had been specially trained to rapidly counter any airborne assault. On the precise night when that specific training would have been essential, Falley was driving through the dark Norman countryside in his staff car. Around 4:30 in the morning, Falley heard the distinct sound of the Allied aircraft passing overhead. He immediately understood the gravity of what was taking place. He instructed his driver to turn the staff car around and speed back to his headquarters at the Château de Bernaville near Picqueville. General Falley never arrived. A small, disorganized group of American paratroopers from the 508th Paratroop Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division had landed close to the chateau. They had established an impromptu ambush position on the main road leading to the headquarters. When Falley's staff car approached, the Americans opened fire. First Lieutenant Malcolm Bryn, a 24-year-old officer from the 3rd Battalion's headquarters company, shot and killed General Falley as the German tried to escape his vehicle. Falley thus became the first German general to lose his life during the entire Normandy invasion. He was dead within hours of the first drops, before he could issue even a single counter-order, and before he could organize any sort of coordinated response to the American assault. The consequence of Falley's death immediately fractured the German command structure. The 91st Division, which was strategically positioned to neutralize airborne operations, was now without a leader at the most critical possible moment. And this was merely one casualty among many. Across the entire Carentan Peninsula, German commanders were being killed, captured, or simply cut off and separated from their units. The intricate military hierarchy was disintegrating rapidly, even before the main beach landings had commenced. The American airborne operation had been designed with clearly defined objectives. The 82nd Airborne was tasked with securing the pivotal town of Saint-Mère-Église and the river crossings over the Mer de Ré River. The 101st Airborne was instructed to seize the causeways leading inland from Utah Beach and effectively block German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones. These were all logical, precise military goals, but the implementation of the plan went severely wrong almost instantly. Heavy cloud cover over the peninsula caused the massive transport pilots to climb or dive in a frantic attempt to avoid mid-air collisions. German anti-aircraft fire further scattered the vast formations. Many pilots, executing combat missions for the first time, released their paratroopers too early, too late, or simply wherever they happened to be when panic took over. The result was a disastrous, massive dispersal. Paratroopers who were supposed to land together found themselves completely isolated. Units that were meant to rally at specific assembly points were instead spread out over hundreds of square miles of the Norman landscape. The official figures were shocking. Of the 6,928 men from the 101st Airborne who jumped that night, only 1 in 6 landed anywhere near their assigned drop zones. The 508th Paratroop Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne suffered the most extreme scatter, with only 25% of its men landing within a mile of their intended targets. After a full 24 hours of fighting, the 101st Airborne could account for only 2,500 of its 6,000 men under direct division control. The rest were scattered, taken prisoner, wounded, or had been killed. Private First Class Bob Nobles of the 508th Paratroop Infantry Regiment landed alone in a farmer's field, having no idea of his location. He could hear intense gunfire ringing out in every direction. He had lost most of his essential equipment during the jump. His first interaction with another American soldier came when a man emerged from the darkness shouting, "Don't shoot! Don't shoot! I'm from Kokomo, Indiana. I forgot the password." Nobles burst out laughing. Surrounded by the enemy in the heart of occupied France, not knowing if he would survive the darkness, he still found himself laughing. This scene perfectly encapsulated the American paratrooper, not a perfectly disciplined automaton executing a flawless blueprint, but a resourceful human being, adapting, improvising, and flat out refusing to be immobilized by the fear or the total confusion of the moment.
For the German defenders, this widespread, nightmarish scattering was completely incomprehensible. German military doctrine dictated that an airborne attack would target specific, vital objectives.
Defenders were expected to quickly identify the drop zones, ascertain the enemy's intentions, and concentrate powerful forces to crush the landing before it could consolidate. But how do you concentrate your forces against an enemy that seems to be simultaneously everywhere and nowhere? How can you identify a drop zone when paratroopers are falling into every single field, marsh, and village for miles in all directions? The German response crumbled almost immediately. Local commanders were forced to confront threats appearing in their immediate vicinity. They could not wait for directives from higher headquarters because higher headquarters had no clear idea what was even happening. Telephone lines had been severed. Messengers were ambushed. The vital radio networks were jammed with a torrent of confused and often contradictory field reports. General Oskar Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commander of the 709th Infantry Division, had been at the Rennes war game when the invasion began. He raced back to find his division in absolute turmoil. In his post-war testimony for the United States Army Historical Division, von Schlieben recounted that by June 7th, his regiment was completely incapable of capturing Sainte-Mère-Église, much less holding it against the relentless fire of enemy naval guns and tanks. He personally had to rally retreating troops to stop what he termed the beginnings of a panic caused by enemy armor. The German General Staff had a specific term for this kind of situation, Kriegsnebel, or the fog of war. But this level of fog was unlike anything they had ever experienced. It was not merely confusion about the enemy's precise movements, it was a state of total uncertainty regarding the fundamental nature of the threat itself. Were these paratroopers the main thrust of the invasion, or just a diversionary force? Were there a few thousand or tens of thousands of them? Were they targeting Cherbourg or Carentan or some objective not yet identified? In the paralyzing vacuum of clear intelligence, German commanders hesitated, and hesitation in warfare is often a sentence of death. The 7th Army headquarters first received confirmation of parachute drops around 01:30 in the morning. General Friedrich Dolman, the Army commander, was attending the war game in Rennes, the very event that had pulled so many high-ranking officers away from their essential posts. He did not return to his headquarters until after sunrise. The scheduling of this military exercise proved catastrophically bad for the German defense. Approximately half of all division commanders on the Cotentin Peninsula were away from their commands when the American paratroopers began landing. A quarter of all regimental commanders were also absent. The war game had been organized to test German reactions to an Allied landing. Instead, it guaranteed that the actual invasion would face a command structure that was effectively decapitated. Von Schlieben later noted that he had departed for Rennes late on the afternoon of June 5th, alongside the commander of the 739th Grenadier Regiment. When the main invasion commenced, they were miles from their units, unable to transmit orders, unable to coordinate a response, and unable to do anything but rush back through the black Norman night, praying they could reach their commands before it was permanently too late. In Dolman's absence, the 7th Army Chief of Staff, General Major Max Pemsel, desperately tried to make sense of the conflicting reports pouring in. Paratroopers were sighted near Sainte-Mère-Église. Paratroopers were being reported south of Carentan. Paratroopers were supposedly landing near Montbourg, near Valognes, and at dozens of other scattered locations across the peninsula. Pemsel was firmly convinced this represented the real invasion. He called General Günther Blümtritt at OB West headquarters, insisting that Normandy was the main Allied effort. Blümtritt then reported to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who summarily dismissed this assessment. Normandy, von Rundstedt announced, was merely a diversion. The true invasion would surely land at the Pas de Calais. This crippling disagreement at the very highest levels of German command paralyzed any effective response for several critical hours. Pemsel was correct, von Rundstedt was wrong, but by the time the truth became absolutely undeniable, the Americans had already established a secure foothold. The dummy parachutists dropped by the Allies only amplified the confusion. These were small, weighted mannequins fitted with parachutes designed specifically to draw German attention away from the actual drop zones. When they impacted the ground, small explosive charges simulated the sound of gunfire. German units wasted precious, irreplaceable hours responding to these phantom threats. By the time Pemsel fully realized that the main American assault was concentrated on the eastern half of the Carentan Peninsula, it was too late to mount a powerful, coordinated counter-response. The paratroopers had already secured key positions. The beach landings had begun. The entire German defensive strategy was in ruins. The failure of German command and control on D-Day was not simply the result of bad fortune. It was the direct outcome of a deliberate American strategy, though not entirely the strategy the planners had envisioned. The original architects of the airborne operation had intended for the troopers to land in tightly concentrated groups, rapidly seize specific objectives, and hold them until forces from the beaches could provide relief. The widely scattered drops that actually occurred were considered a catastrophic failure at the time. Yet the ensuing chaos served the American mission perfectly, even if it was unintentional. The German military was structurally organized to counter identified threats located in specific, known locations. When threats materialized everywhere at the same time, the entire defensive mechanism shattered. First Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Paratrooper Infantry Division, 101st Airborne Division, touched down in a field near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont at approximately 01:20 a.m. Like most paratroopers that dark night, he found himself alone and deeply disoriented. Winters was 26 years old, a young man from Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. He had never experienced combat before. The aircraft carrying his commander officer and most of the company headquarters staff had been shot down. Every officer senior to Winters and Easy Company was dead or missing. Within a matter of hours, Winters would lead one of the most celebrated small unit assaults of the entire war. By the break of dawn, Winters had managed to gather a group of approximately a dozen men from various scattered units. His battalion commander gave him the order to deal with a German artillery battery that was relentlessly shelling Utah Beach. The battery was located at a position called Brécourt Manor, roughly 300 meters from the American assembly point. Winters performed a rapid reconnaissance. He discovered 4 German 105mm howitzers linked by a deep trench system and defended by approximately 60 soldiers with multiple machine gun emplantments. He had a mere 12 men. Winters divided his tiny force into separate assault and support elements. He positioned machine guns to lay down concentrated covering fire. He sent 3 men to flank the first gun position using hand grenades. Then he personally led the subsequent assault down the trench line. The attack was executed with textbook precision, and the textbook was being written in that moment. Winters and his men captured the first gun, then the second, then the third. Reinforcements arrived from Dog Company under 2nd Lieutenant Ronald Spears. Together they secured the 4th and final gun. By the end of the action, approximately 23 men had taken part. The entire assault had lasted about 3 hours. Winters' group killed 15 German soldiers, wounded many more, and critically captured a map detailing the precise locations of all German artillery across the Carentan Peninsula. That captured map would prove invaluable to the advancing American forces. The suppression of the battery allowed troops landing at Utah Beach to move inland with far fewer casualties than they would have otherwise. Winters was recommended for the Medal of Honor.
He was instead awarded the Distinguished Service Cross due to a policy limiting the Medal of Honor to only one per division for the invasion. What made the Brécourt Manor assault so significant was not just the tactical success. It was the way Winters instantly adapted to impossible circumstances. He possessed no heavy weapons, no air support, and no numerical advantage. He had a handful of men, most of whom he had never even met before, and he attacked regardless.
Aggression wins when the plan fails. This same aggressive spirit was repeated all across the Cotentin Peninsula on June 6th. Small groups of American paratroopers, cut off from their units and their commanders, did not take cover and wait for rescue. They attacked. In the town of Saint-Mère-Église, paratroopers from the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment seized total control before dawn. The town became the first in France to be liberated by the advancing American forces. The assault was completely uncoordinated. It was not planned in advance. It happened because individual soldiers recognized an opportunity and instantly acted on it. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss led a small contingent into the town square around 04 hours. His men had landed dispersed throughout the surrounding area. Most had lost their weapons bundles. Some possessed only sidearms and knives. They still captured the town. German defenders were either killed or captured before they could organize any meaningful resistance. The swastika flag was ripped down from the town hall. An American flag, which one sergeant had carried carefully folded inside his jump jacket, was raised in its place. This was not the expected function of an invasion. An invasion required months of preparation, a massive concentration of force, and overwhelming firepower. Saint-Mère-Église fell to a small group of men who acted before the enemy could even grasp what was happening. Similar accounts of initiative played out throughout the Norman countryside that night. Staff Sergeant Harrison Summers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment spearheaded an assault on a cluster of German barracks buildings near the small village of Le Mesnil. He had been ordered to clear the buildings with a small squad of 15 men. When the majority of his men hesitated, Summers moved forward alone, with only Private William Burt providing machine gun cover and Private John Camion joining the assault. Summers kicked open the first door and quickly killed every soldier inside with his submachine gun. He then proceeded to the next building, and the next. For 5 brutal hours, Summers fought his way through the German position, one building at a time, one room at a time. By the time he finished, Summers had killed more than 30 German soldiers. His commanding officer immediately recommended him for the Medal of Honor. Like Winters, he was awarded a lesser decoration. The accounts of individual heroism from D-Day could easily fill several volumes. Every single paratrooper who jumped that night had a story to tell. Most of those stories will, sadly, never be known. The men who could share them are now gone, and they took their memories with them. What remains is the cumulative historical record, and that record tells a consistent narrative of men who utterly refused to accept that their situation was hopeless. The German officer corps had been trained to expect calculated, rational behavior from their enemies. An outnumbered force should attempt to preserve its strength. A scattered force should try to regroup before initiating any engagement. An isolated force should establish defenses and hold until relieved. The Americans followed none of these protocols. Major Friedrich Vondran experienced his own bitter encounter with this American aggression starting on June 6th. Vondran commanded the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, one of the most elite units in the German army. His paratroopers were veterans of combat in Crete, North Africa, and the Eastern Front. They were among the most highly trained soldiers in the Wehrmacht. Vondran had positioned his regiment to defend Carentan, a critical crossroads town that linked the American landing beaches at Utah and Omaha. Whoever controlled Carentan controlled the crucial connection between the two American beachheads. His regiment earned a grim distinction that morning. They were the very first German unit to positively identify enemy soldiers landing in Normandy, specifically the pathfinders of the 101st Airborne Division, who landed between Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and Carentan around 6 a.m. on June 6th.
Vondran personally interrogated captured American pathfinders in Carentan. He was particularly struck by their distinctive appearance. Many had shaved their heads into mohawk hairstyles and painted their faces for battle. Vondran reportedly remarked to his staff, "Now they are sending us their Indians." The captured Americans told Vondran something that would prove eerily prophetic. They claimed that German forces believed there were approximately 10 times as many American soldiers on the peninsula as there actually were. The massive scattered drops had successfully created an illusion of overwhelming force. Vondran anticipated the Americans would spend several days consolidating their dispersed troops before attempting any large-scale operations. The Americans attacked Carentan on June 10th, just 4 days after the initial landings. The assault on Carentan quickly became one of the most brutal and intense battles of the entire Normandy campaign. American paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division advanced along exposed causeways under relentless, withering German fire. They crossed waterlogged fields, wading waist-deep in water. They fought house to house through the narrow streets of the town. Vondran later wrote about his opponents with unmistakable respect. He noted their willingness to sustain heavy casualties, their refusal to break under fire, and their aggressive tactics, even when clearly outnumbered. His regiment earned a telling nickname from the Americans they fought. They called them the Lions of Carentan. At one stage during the battle, the Americans negotiated a 2-hour truce at noon on June 11th to recover their dead and wounded. General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, used this break to send a direct message to Vondran demanding his surrender. Vondran had received explicit orders from Field Marshal Rommel to hold Carentan at all costs. He could not surrender even if he had wanted to, but his forces were rapidly running out of ammunition. His regiment had taken severe casualties, yet the Americans kept pressing. When Taylor's surrender demand arrived, Hauptmann Rolf Mausch, commanding the 2nd Battalion, replied in English with a pointed question of his own. "Would you surrender in the same situation?" The fighting surrounding Carentan had already cost Vondran's regiment terribly. Hauptmann Emil Prachner, commanding the 1st Battalion, had led counterattacks against the 101st Airborne at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. By the evening of June 7th, Prachner's men were decimated, with most of them wounded and incapable of fighting. They accepted a surrender offer from Colonel Howard Johnson of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment. Only 25 men managed to escape and reach Carentan. These elite German paratroopers were being destroyed by American paratroopers who had been in combat for less than 48 hours. On June 12th, Vondran finally ordered his surviving troops to withdraw from Carentan under the cover of darkness. The intense fighting continued through a German counterattack on June 13th, before the town ultimately fell securely to the Americans on June 14th. The capture of Carentan successfully linked the Utah and Omaha beachheads. The American position in Normandy was now secure, and Vondran's elite paratroopers had been pushed back by men who had been in combat for less than a week. The German 7th Army maintained meticulous records of the Normandy campaign. These documents contained detailed after-action reports, intelligence summaries, and the personal observations of officers across all command levels. These documents consistently reveal a military organization struggling desperately to comprehend an enemy that simply did not behave as expected. German intelligence officers compiled extensive analyses of American tactics. They carefully studied captured documents. They exhaustively interrogated prisoners. They tried to find discernible patterns that would allow them to forecast American behavior. They failed for the most part. A German report dated June 20, 1944, sometimes referred to as the von Rundstedt Report, number 50/5044, attempted to summarize the unfolding situation. The document observed that only in the American bridgehead north of Carentan were the enemy airborne troops compressed in the direction of the coastal defense after tough fighting for days. The phrasing itself betrayed the German frustration. They had expected to rapidly crush the paratroopers. They had fought for days merely to contain them. The American paratroopers did not adhere to predictable patterns because they were not striving to follow any patterns. They were simply focused on achieving their objectives. When one method proved ineffective, they immediately tried another. When battlefield conditions shifted, they quickly adapted. They were driven by goals rather than adherence to strict procedure.
This goal-oriented approach was second nature to American soldiers. It reflected how they were raised. American culture during the 1930s and 40s strongly emphasized practical, hands-on problem-solving. The men who became paratroopers had grown up tinkering with machinery, improvising quick solutions, and figuring things out for themselves. They brought this resourceful mentality directly to the battlefield, and it drove their German opponents to distraction. Consistent themes recur in German documents when discussing American paratroopers. The word aggressive appears constantly. German officers noted that American paratroopers attacked when any logical assessment suggested they should be defending. They took risks that seemed utterly reckless. They relentlessly pressed forward despite casualty rates that would have caused other units to fall back. The word unpredictable appears almost as frequently. German intelligence officers complained that American paratrooper units did not operate according to rational military principles. They did not wait for their supply lines to catch up. They did not pause to consolidate their positions. They appeared utterly unconcerned that they were outnumbered or entirely surrounded. Perhaps most tellingly, the German reports repeatedly highlighted the quality of American junior leadership. In the Wehrmacht, decisions strictly flowed from the top down. Officers issued precise orders, and soldiers executed them. Initiative at the lower ranks was generally not encouraged. American paratroopers operated in a fundamentally different way. When officers were killed or separated from their units, sergeants immediately assumed command. When sergeants were unavailable, corporals stepped up. Even privates made critical tactical decisions that, in the German army, would have required authorization from officers far above their pay grade. This decentralized approach greatly confused German defenders. They could not successfully decapitate American units by eliminating their officers, because the units simply continued fighting under whoever was left alive to lead them. Fallschirmjäger Erwin Schmeiger served in the 9th Parachute Regiment during the Normandy campaign. In a post-war interview recorded by military historian Gilberto Villahermosa, he recalled confronting American troops near Hill 192, close to the town of Saint-Lô. Schmeiger described his opponents as madmen. He specifically mentioned the Americans of the 2nd Infantry Division, whose soldiers wore the Indian head insignia on their shoulders. But his description could have easily applied to any of the American units fighting in Normandy that summer. Schmeiger remembered one specific night vividly. German paratroopers were holding positions along the edge of a dense wood, each man in a foxhole situated approximately 50 meters apart. They could clearly hear Americans moving stealthily in the darkness. There was no shooting, no artillery fire, only the faint sound of men creeping through the undergrowth. Then Schmeiger heard a terrible scream. A German soldier in a nearby foxhole had been killed silently, his throat cut. Schmeiger spent the rest of the dark night in his foxhole, trembling with deep-seated fear, completely unable to see his enemy. He knew the Americans were somewhere in the darkness, simply waiting. This was psychological warfare of the most basic yet most effective kind. The Americans had quickly learned to fight like ruthless hunters. They moved under the cover of night. They killed silently when the opportunity arose. They used the very terrain that the Germans had assumed would protect them as cover for their own infiltration. Schmeiger survived the war. Many of his comrades did not. The scattered airborne drops on June 6th were initially seen as a failure by American planners. The casualty count was high. Most units landed far from their intended targets. The intricate, elaborate plans developed over months of preparation were rendered useless within minutes of the first jumps. But the Germans witnessed something entirely different. They saw an enemy who transformed disaster into a strategic advantage. The dispersed drops had successfully generated widespread confusion, not just for the Americans, but for the Germans as well. The defenders could not pinpoint the main threat because there was no main threat. There were hundreds of small immediate threats appearing everywhere at once. German reserve units that should have been counterattacking the beaches were instead chasing phantom paratroopers through the Norman hedgerows. Units that should have been reinforcing the coastal defenses were fighting desperate skirmishes in their own rear areas. The entire German defensive scheme was disrupted not by one concentrated blow, but by 1,000 unexpected pinpricks that collectively bled the defense dry. By the close of June 6th, the American Airborne Divisions had sustained approximately 2,500 casualties, but they had achieved something that no amount of mere planning could have guaranteed. They had completely paralyzed the German response at the most crucial moment of the invasion. The days that followed June 6th brought even more intense fighting. The Norman bocage, ancient earthen walls topped with thick vegetation, transformed every field into a potential fortress. German defenders expertly used these natural barriers to slow the American advance to a near halt. The paratroopers who had survived the initial drop now found themselves battling a different type of war. This was not mobile warfare of an airborne assault. This was slow, grinding, and brutal combat measured in yards instead of miles. The hedgerow fighting tested American soldiers in ways that nothing in their training had prepared them for. Visibility was often limited to a few feet. Enemies could be concealed on the other side of a wall just meters away. Every advance demanded clearing fields one at a time, often at terrible cost. The German defenders fought with great skill and absolute determination. Many were hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, steeled by years of combat against the Soviets. They knew how to utilize the terrain. They knew how to set deadly ambushes. They knew how to exact a steep price for every inch of ground gained. But the American paratroopers adapted once again. They rapidly developed new tactics for hedgerow fighting. They learned to work closely with tanks, using specialized explosives to blast openings in the earthen walls. They learned to synchronize intense artillery fire with infantry assaults. They learned to move under the cover of night, infiltrating German positions in the darkness. German officers who faced them noted this alarming adaptability with profound concern. The Americans they fought in late June were simply not the same soldiers who had landed on June 6th. They were tougher, more experienced, and far more lethal. The German army never forgot the brutal lessons learned in Normandy. Neither did the American paratroopers. When Hitler launched his final massive offensive in the West in December 1944, the German attack drove a deep bulge into the American lines in the Ardennes region of Belgium. German panzer divisions raced toward the vital crossroads town of Bastogne. The Americans urgently rushed the 101st Airborne Division to hold the town. These were many of the same men who had jumped into Normandy 6 months earlier. They arrived in Bastogne on December 19th, just hours before German forces fully encircled the town. For the next week, the paratroopers held Bastogne against everything the Germans could unleash. They fought in sub-zero temperatures with gravely inadequate supplies of ammunition, food, and vital medical equipment. They were dangerously outnumbered, outgunned, and completely cut off from all relief. On December 22nd, German officers approached the American lines under a formal flag of truce. They carried a written demand for the American commander's surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st Airborne, gave them a single-word reply: nuts. The German officers were thoroughly confused by this American slang. They requested clarification. An American colonel explained, "The general's answer is no." The Germans departed. The artillery bombardment resumed, and the paratroopers continued fighting. 4 days later, armored units from General George Patton's Third Army broke through the German encirclement and relieved Bastogne. The Battle of the Bulge was contained. The German offensive collapsed, and the 101st Airborne added yet another chapter to its now legendary history. The Germans who survived the Battle of the Bulge would later describe the American paratroopers at Bastogne with the identical mixture of frustration and professional respect that their predecessors had shown after Normandy. These were not men who adhered to rational military calculations. They were men who steadfastly refused to surrender, regardless of the daunting odds. The establishment of American airborne forces had been controversial from the outset. In 1940, the United States Army possessed no paratroopers. The concept of vertical envelopment, dropping soldiers behind enemy lines via parachute, had been pioneered by the Soviets in the 1940s.
The Germans had employed airborne forces with spectacular success in their conquests of Norway, the Low Countries, and Crete. American military leaders observed these developments with professional interest, yet deep skepticism. Airborne operations were inherently expensive. Training paratroopers demanded specialized, costly equipment and an extensive time commitment. The casualty rates during combat jumps were frighteningly high. Many senior officers openly questioned whether the substantial benefits truly justified the costs. General George Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, ultimately decided they did. He authorized the formation of a test platoon at Fort Benning, Georgia. In June 1940, the platoon consisted of 50 volunteers drawn from the 29th Infantry Regiment. On August 16, 1940, Lieutenant William Ryder became the first American officer to complete an official military parachute jump. Private William King was the first enlisted man to jump, according to various accounts. King was only first because the soldier ahead of him in line refused to go. The airborne age of the American military had officially begun. What followed was one of the most demanding training programs in military history. Paratrooper candidates were pushed far beyond their physical and psychological limits. They ran many miles every day. They practiced rigorous hand-to-hand combat. They were compelled to pack their own parachutes, fully aware that a single mistake could cost them their lives. The training proceeded at a brutal, unyielding pace. Candidates completed a 3-week course that compressed months of standard infantry instruction into 21 days of constant physical and mental stress. Every single day began before dawn with runs that gradually increased in length. 5 miles became 10 miles, 10 miles became 20. The famous training towers at Fort Benning, standing 250 feet tall, simulated the terrifying experience of a parachute descent. Men were hoisted to the top, strapped into a parachute harness, and dropped. The experience taught them how to manage the parachute's opening shock and how to land correctly without breaking their bones. Many candidates failed to make the cut. The severe physical requirements quickly eliminated those who could not keep up with the relentless demands. The intense psychological pressure weeded out those who could not overcome their innate fear of heights, of jumping, and of the profound unknown. Those who successfully remained developed a unique esprit de corps unlike any other unit in the American military. They wore distinctive boots. They received additional pay. They earned the coveted silver wings of a qualified paratrooper only after completing 5 successful training jumps. The men who endured this rigorous training developed a sense of superiority that often bordered on outright arrogance. They genuinely believed they were the elite soldiers in the entire army. They looked down on regular infantry as legs, lesser beings who could not possibly meet the paratrooper standards. This fierce pride served a vital purpose. Men who believed they were elite
fought like elite soldiers. The training forged not just physical capability, but a deep, unshakable psychological confidence that would prove absolutely essential in combat. By June 1944, the American Airborne Force had expanded from a 50-man test platoon to 5 complete divisions. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions had already seen combat in Sicily and Italy. They knew precisely what awaited them in France. Many of them would not survive. They jumped anyway. The German military extensively analyzed American paratrooper tactics following Normandy. Intelligence officers compiled detailed reports. Commanders convened to discuss lessons learned. The Wehrmacht rapidly adapted its defenses to counter any future airborne operations. But there remained one element of American paratrooper effectiveness that the Germans could neither successfully replicate nor counter. It was not a weapon or a specific tactic, it was a mindset. American military culture in World War II emphasized individual initiative in ways that German culture did not. American soldiers were fully expected to think for themselves whenever circumstances demanded it. They were trained to successfully accomplish objectives, not simply to blindly follow orders. This fundamental difference became absolutely critical in airborne operations, where the inherent chaos of combat jumps routinely separated men from their leaders and units from their original plans. German soldiers facing similar circumstances often waited for orders that never arrived. American soldiers improvised. The German term for this crucial quality was Auftragstaktik, or mission-oriented tactics. Ironically, German military theorists had pioneered this very approach in the 19th century. Yet by World War II, the German army had become increasingly rigid and centrally controlled under Hitler's regime. The Americans, without even knowing the German terminology, had adopted the core German theory and carried it far further than the Germans themselves. Friedrich Vondran survived the war. He was captured during the Battle of the Bulge after leading a failed German paratrooper operation behind American lines. He later served in the West German Army during the Cold War and eventually became a professor of political science. In 1948, while held at the Allendorf prisoner of war camp, Vondran wrote a meticulously detailed account of his regiment's operations for the United States Army Historical Division. The document, known as Foreign Military Manuscript B-839, remains one of the most important German primary sources on the Normandy campaign. In this extensive account, Vondran reflected deeply on his experiences fighting American paratroopers. He gave them full credit for their aggressive courage and their striking tactical flexibility. He openly acknowledged that they had surprised him not just once, but repeatedly. Vondran had expected the Americans to fight like Europeans. He had anticipated them following the same military logic that he followed, the same calculations of risk and reward, the same rational assessments of what was achievable and what was foolish. The Americans simply refused to cooperate with his expectations. They attacked when all logic suggested they should have defended. They advanced when they should have retreated. They fought as tenacious individuals when their large units fell apart, and they instantly fought as cohesive units when their leaders were killed. They would not surrender. Vondran was a thoughtful, analytical man. He dedicated considerable time after the war to understanding exactly what he had experienced. He concluded that the American approach to warfare was fundamentally distinct from the European military tradition. European armies, including his own, treated war as a science. There were established principles to be meticulously followed, calculations to be made, and rules to be observed. Victory, they believed, belonged to the force that applied these principles most efficiently. The Americans, Vondran concluded, treated war as a practical problem that required solving. When one strategy failed, they quickly attempted another. When their commanders were killed, new leaders instantly emerged. When their detailed plans fell apart, they created new plans on the fly. They were practical in a way that seemed almost negligent to professionally trained officers. But this inherent practicality, this immediate willingness to improvise, gave them a critical advantage that no amount of pure training or discipline could possibly match. They were unpredictable, and unpredictability is a potent weapon in itself. Vondran's post-war writings significantly influenced a generation of German military thinkers. His analysis of American combat tactics was closely studied in military academies. His conclusion that the Americans had won not solely through superior resources, but through a superior mindset, directly challenged assumptions that had guided European military thinking for centuries. This stubborn inability to accept defeat, this aggressive spirit that seemed completely irrational to German observers, was not something that could be instilled in training camps. It originated from somewhere deeper within the men. Perhaps it arose from the strictly volunteer nature of the airborne forces. Every American paratrooper had actively chosen to be there. They had volunteered for the Army, then volunteered again for the paratroopers, and then volunteered a third time for combat duty. These were men who actively ran toward danger rather than away from it. Perhaps it stemmed from American culture itself. The soldiers who jumped into Normandy had grown up enduring the Great Depression. They had learned resilience the hard way. They had developed an optimistic, ferocious stubbornness that refused to acknowledge limitations. Perhaps it simply came from the profound conviction that they were fighting for a cause worth dying for. The men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions knew the monstrous threat the Nazis represented. They knew the dark fate that awaited Europe if Hitler prevailed. They jumped into the intense darkness regardless. The German military extensively analyzed American paratrooper tactics following Normandy. Intelligence officers compiled detailed reports. Commanders convened to discuss lessons learned. The Wehrmacht rapidly adapted its defenses to counter any future airborne operations. But there remained one element of
They were Americans. They came from farms in Iowa and industrial factories in Detroit. They came from the hills of Appalachia and the teeming streets of Brooklyn. They came from every background and every circumstance that a vast, diverse nation could produce. And when they leaped from those C-47 transport planes into the darkness over Normandy, they carried with them something that no German bullet could destroy. They carried the conviction that they would inevitably win. That belief, that fierce optimism, even when facing impossible odds, was what the German officers subconsciously sensed when they wrote their military reports. It was what Schmege felt when he trembled in his small foxhole, waiting for the Americans in the darkness. It was what Vondran confronted at Carentan when his elite paratroopers were pushed back by men who had never experienced combat before D-Day. They won because they refused to lose. The German term for it might be Kampfgeist, or fighting spirit. The American term for it was simply guts. The heritage of the American paratroopers who fought in World War II extends far beyond their initial tactical victories. The 82nd Airborne Division has remained on active duty continuously from 1942 to the present day. It has deployed to every single major American military engagement since Normandy. Its soldiers have jumped into combat in Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The 101st Airborne Division transitioned to an air assault role in the 1970s. It remains one of the most frequently deployed divisions in the entire American Army. The famous Screaming Eagle patch worn by soldiers at Utah Beach in 1944 is still proudly worn by soldiers serving all around the world today. More significantly, the paratroopers of World War II established a potent tradition of aggressive, flexible, mission-oriented warfare that continues to shape American military doctrine. The valuable lessons learned at Brécourt Manor are still taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point. The uncompromising spirit that held Bastogne is still instilled in every soldier who earns the parachutist badge. The German officers who genuinely feared American paratroopers were entirely justified in their fear. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were volunteers who had endured truly brutal training to earn the privilege of leaping from aircraft into combat. They were men who had accepted that their missions would routinely demand them to fight when vastly outnumbered, entirely surrounded, and completely cut off from support. They were men who had deep faith in themselves and in each other, and that fierce collective belief made them dangerous in ways that German military machine could neither predict nor counter. When historians examine the Normandy invasion, they frequently focus on the massive scale of the operation, the thousands of naval ships, the hundreds of thousands of infantry soldiers, the elaborate deception strategies, and the logistical planning. These components were undeniably crucial. Without them, the invasion could never have succeeded. But the invasion also succeeded because 13,000 young Americans voluntarily jumped from transport aircraft in the middle of the night into a country they had never seen, to fight an enemy they had never faced, with no real guarantee that they would survive until the sun rose. The precise final numbers were recorded. 101st Airborne Division delivered 6,928 paratroopers into the air aboard 432 C-47 transport aircraft. The 82nd Airborne Division sent 6,420 men aboard 369 aircraft. Together, they constituted the largest airborne assault in history up to that time. By the end of June 6th, they had suffered approximately 2,499 total casualties. 182 men of the 101st were confirmed killed. 156 men of the 82nd were dead. Hundreds more were wounded. Hundreds more were missing, their fates unknown. They jumped because they believed it was fundamentally necessary. They fought because they flatly refused to accept defeat. They won because they embodied exactly what the German officers feared most. They were American paratroopers, and on June 6, 1944, they fundamentally altered the course of the world. Decades after the conclusion of the war, veterans of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions began returning to Normandy. They came to honor the graves of their lost comrades. They came to walk the battlegrounds where they had once fought. They came to remember. The resilient people of Normandy welcomed them with open arms. The French had never forgotten the sacrifices the Americans had made. In towns such as Saint-Mère-Église and Carentan, streets were formally named after American soldiers. Monuments were erected. Every June, the American flag flew proudly alongside the French tricolor. These aging veterans were universally treated as heroes. Children brought them fresh flowers. Adults shook their hands with deep gratitude. The French people understood the profound price that had been paid to secure the liberation of their country. Yet the veterans themselves often appeared uneasy with the title of hero. When questioned about their actions, they typically deferred the credit. They talked about the men they had served alongside. They talked about the ones who never came home. They seldom spoke about their personal courage. Dick Winters, who masterfully led the assault at Brécourt Manor, became arguably the most famous paratrooper of the war following the publication of Stephen Ambrose's book, Band of Brothers, and the subsequent HBO television series. People wrote to him constantly. They requested autographs. They called him a hero. Winters passed away in January 2011 at the age of 92. In one of his final recorded interviews, he reflected on the title others had given him. "I was not a hero," Winters stated. "The genuine heroes were the men who did not return." This profound modesty was a characteristic trait of the generation that fought World War II. They did not view themselves as exceptional individuals. They saw themselves as ordinary people who had been tasked with an extraordinary job. Perhaps that was the ultimate source of their incredible strength. They did not believe they were special. They simply believed they had to do what needed to be done. The German officers who faced them in Normandy might have been astonished to learn how the Americans viewed themselves. The paratroopers who appeared so fearsome, so aggressively unstoppable, were frequently scared young men who simply kept moving forward because they couldn't fathom doing anything else. The courage was undeniable, but it was not the courage of men who were free of fear. It was the courage of men who felt fear deeply and acted despite it. It was the courage of men who stared at impossible odds and firmly decided to try. That particular brand of courage cannot be manufactured in training camps. It cannot be dictated by generals. It can only originate from somewhere deep inside the men themselves. The German officers recognized it, they genuinely feared it, and ultimately they were defeated by it. The last remaining American paratroopers who jumped on D-Day are now almost all gone. The youngest among them would be approaching 100 years old today. Each passing year, fewer remain to personally share their stories. This makes the historical record more critical than ever. The diaries and letters, the after-action reports and intelligence summaries, the surviving photographs and films. These documents are now our primary connection to the events that unfolded in those Norman fields in June 1944. The German sources are especially valuable because they provide an invaluable perspective that American accounts cannot offer. We know what the paratroopers believed they were doing. The German documents tell us the profound effect they actually had. Those documents are utterly consistent. The American paratroopers terrified their adversaries, not because they were flawless soldiers, but because they were relentless soldiers. Not because they executed perfect operations, but because they kept fighting even when the perfect operations collapsed. The sheer chaos of Normandy should have resulted in a German victory. The scattered drops, the lost essential equipment, the broken communications, the dead commanders. All of these factors should have permitted the Wehrmacht to defeat the airborne assault in detail before the beach landings could consolidate. Instead, the chaos was instantly transformed into an American advantage. The very factors that should have beaten the paratroopers became the factors that paralyzed the German response. This transformation of fundamental weakness into overwhelming strength is the central narrative of the American airborne experience in World War II. It succeeded not because of superior planning or equipment. It succeeded because of the quality of the men who jumped. They were farmers and factory workers, students and salesmen. They came from every state and every social background. They shared only a willingness to volunteer for the most dangerous mission in the American military. And when they landed in Normandy, when everything went wrong, when the detailed plans collapsed and the darkness enveloped them, they found within themselves a capacity for raw improvisation and fierce aggression that no training program could ever have predicted. The German officers who wrote about them after the war were attempting to explain something that defied easy explanation. How did ordinary men become such extraordinary soldiers? How did scattered groups become an effective forcing force? How did utter chaos become ultimate victory? The final answers to these questions are not found in military manuals. They are found in the human spirit, in the unwavering determination that refuses to accept defeat, in the radical adaptability that